Hello, Acceleration Nation. I am super excited to have Sonal Bahl on my podcast today. Sonal and I met, as I meet most people nowadays. I met her on LinkedIn back in January of 2022. And I actually looked back on my messages that I sent her before I joined. And I was complimenting her because she just had an engaging podcast with Dan Roth from LinkedIn on her podcast. And we'll go into her podcast. And I was like, wow, you have an awesome podcast. I would love to connect with you. And because Sonal is such an amazing woman, she responded right away. And we began our internet relationship and just started to take it virtually over the last several weeks or months. But Sonal is an amazing career coach. She is actually a top 25 career coach according to JobScan. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But without further ado, I would love Sonal to introduce herself to the Acceleration Nation.
Al, such a pleasure to be here. I'm so happy we met. I think it made a difference that you had a very personalized message on LinkedIn, and it's such a great thing to do. And look where we are today. Anytime I'm in New York next, I will look you up. And it started with one message. So this is a message to someone who's listening today. You're like, oh, they're never going to respond. Oh, why should I bother? Well, bother because anything can happen. So, yeah, I'm a former HR director for over 2 decades and a career strategist, career coach. And it's a huge mission. It's a huge mission of mine. And I feel irritated how unfair life is anyway. And it's even more unfair if you have more money and you can hire people to help you if you're stuck. But if you are slightly underprivileged in that sense, then you're left behind. And that is, I think, one thing that gravitated me to your profile, Al, because it's in your headline. And FYI, little plug, you've been on my podcast too. And you talk about underprivileged, underrepresented. And that's, I think, what gravitated me. So yeah, I help people. Those who have money, we work one-on-one. Those who have less money, there's digital courses out there. How do you make a resume? How do you do LinkedIn? How do you do interviews? Everything is there. And for those who have even less means, I got a YouTube channel, I got a podcast. There's something out there. It's just a question of how much do you want it? Go out there and get it. So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, and that's fantastic. And also, so I did a little research on you, further research on you before joining. And you and I have a lot of similar backgrounds. So you got your undergrad degree in sociology, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah, and I got mine in psychology. Very similar. Then 9 years later or so, you got your MBA from a top
Yes.
MBA program in the world in SYCK.
Yes.
I got mine about 10 years after I graduated
Columbia.
from
Yes.
Columbia. Then you went to large corporations. You were at GE Capital for about 4 years, I think, and then PwC for a couple of years.
Yes.
Um, and and then you launched. You had some other things as well. Also, I see in your LinkedIn profile, which I love how transparent you are. In 2011 to 2013, you said, "Hey, I took a maternity break," which is awesome because that's really what we're doing this for. Like, well, we're helping to accelerate careers and grow careers, but you're a mom, I'm a dad. That is really, at least, very important for me. I'm sure it's important for you as well. And you've where you and I differ a little bit, but we come from different perspectives. Is you've had an experience as an HRBP, HR business partner, and a recruiter, generally in the recruiting and the HR space, whereas I've been like a line manager, a hiring manager. So talk a little bit about that difference, because we can talk all day about the similarities we have. And we can talk about the India versus Jewish, not verse, but the similarities and differences between the Indian culture and Jewish culture. We'll talk about that soon. But talk about how HR and recruiting works and collaborates with the hiring manager or the business line in recruiting and identifying talent.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I do that, also another thing I think that differentiates us, which is very interesting, is also life took me to different parts of the world. So I lived in and worked
Yes.
in Uruguay, Chile, France, I'm in Belgium now, and I'm originally from India. So that's been really interesting. And the
Yeah.
common thread almost throughout, the common thread has been HR, recruiting, people management. It wasn't, it was, yes, I would say, yes, it was by design. But it wasn't by design in the beginning. You said you did psychology and I did sociology. And honestly, when I was in the 12th in India, that's the highest grade before you go to college. There were three. I was like, okay, business looks interesting. Marketing looks advertising type. I'm not sure that's for me. Finance looks numbers. I'm not sure that's for me. Personnel management. That's what they called it in the 90s. Personnel management. What is that? Ooh, this could be interesting. So it was literally a process of elimination. Talk about scientific. And the other thing I wanted to say is, you said career break. It's on my LinkedIn profile. It wasn't a choice. It was due to a layoff, and for a bit of time, I was a bit ashamed of it, and I tried to show that I was doing various things, and I tried to cover it up. So I think there's a lesson there. I've grown and I've evolved, and I embrace it with open arms now. But when you are looking at someone, don't always think they were like this all the time. It's an evolution. It's
Yeah.
change. So yeah, human resources and all these different places has been honestly a massive privilege, and particularly in senior roles, because you get to see and hear things that the rest of the company people wish they did but don't. And you do your best to protect the management's backside, as well
Yeah.
as have the best interest of the employees. And anyone who tells you it's a tightrope and it's really hard, but we go through it, it's true. It's true. Because on one hand, management, those guys are taking care of your salary, but at the same time, the smart ones know who are they, who are they without their employees. So the ones that I've seen do badly are the ones who let that power go to their head, and the ones that I've seen do well are the ones that care. I'm oversimplifying it, but leadership that cares, I've always been a fan of. And I think there's so much that HR does, which honestly shouldn't even be in HR. It's everyone's problem. We're talking about DEI. It's so fashionable to talk about DEI, but honestly, DEI is something in every process, whether it's from procurement, right, to getting quotes from vendors, to hiring, and promoting internally top talent, but also talent management, succession planning. HR is the custodian of this. But why would the CEO not care about that? Because if the CEO gets a brand new role and they want to move to China, and they're like, but who is my CFO? Is that person ready? No. Who is the new CFO? Who could be my replacement? So it's like, oh, HR did a bad job. But I think HR and management are often mirrors of each other. And when you see really bad HR, it is a mirror of poor management, usually.
Yeah.
So kind of like summarizing a bit, but obviously there's more to it.
And you mentioned there that HR is there to cover the company's butt or cover their ass. I think you kind of alluded to that. Talk about that a little bit more, because sometimes I think employees, especially if they're not managers and have not worked with HR that much, think that HR are there to protect them and them as an employee. And you also mentioned that HR works for, I think, the management or leadership. Who does HR work for, and what is their primary motivation for existence?
I think HR knows very clearly. I'm not speaking on behalf of all HR, so before I
Yeah,
get any hate from anyone, but HR, like any profession, they know which side of their bread is buttered. So
yeah,
it's, if you're not getting, it's like a recruiter doesn't external recruiter doesn't work for a job candidate. They work
yeah,
for the firm that's doing the hiring. So um, any HR that says one versus the other is oversimplifying it. So you've got, this is the reason, right? When you meet someone in HR, so it's like, Al, if you meet someone and let's say you're a doctor, and I met you for the first time. What do you think the second thing is that I'm going to say to you, or I'm going to ask you?
I have this injury or I have this illness. Can you help me out with it?
Yeah, yeah. Usually that is the That is the second thing they'll ask. The first thing they'll ask is, oh, what kind of medicine do you practice?
Okay, yeah, that's
Yeah.
actually probably true. Yeah,
Yeah, you will. You will. It's, oh, it's a dentist. Okay. Then you'll say, oh,
yeah,
I got this ache on the bottom, like,
yeah,
it's really been hurting me in my premolars. Uh, so it depends, right? So HR, you'll have talent, you'll have recruiting,
yes,
you'll have comp and ben. So every one of these works for a specific part. So the
yeah,
talent management, etc. There's recruiting. Recruiting is very visible, especially when they don't meet their numbers. Nobody's a fan of them, and when they meet their numbers, nobody celebrates them. Comp and Ben is working very closely with the CHRO as well as
and
different
that's compensation and benefits for those that
compensation and
don't know
benefits.
the
And
parlance, right?
many people think of CNB and compensation and benefits as payroll. It's actually much more strategic than that, because these are the people that make sure that all the benefits, all the compensation, whether it's short term incentives, long term incentives, and everything in between, is at par, if not better, than what's out there in the market. And there's job grading, job evaluation. So it's actually quite technical. And this is the reason that if they don't have this position, if they don't have this department, then salaries will be all over the place. And one of the reasons I say that HR has to protect the management's backside is because management isn't perfect. HR is not perfect. They're all human beings.
Yeah.
There are either mistakes or exceptions much more frequently than we realize.
hmm And one area that you didn't mention as part of HR is ER, employee relations,
Yeah.
and
So
that,
employee relations, I think, is a little bit um, different depending on which part of the world you are in. And I know in the US, employee relations tends to be a bit more on the, investigations, complaints, unions, lawsuits, etc.
yeah,
An HR business partner can be a bit different in different parts of the world, but this is the day-to-day functioning and the operation, and they have to make sure. HRBP has to make sure. I could say maybe ER as well, employee relations manager. They got to make sure the day-to-day is a smooth, oiled machine, and if there are issues, they are nipped in the bud way before they are escalated. So
yep,
essentially, not everyone's cup of tea. It's a hard job, and HR is not perfect, and they're human beings. And I don't like it when I see this in certain companies where, like, oh, HR, oh my gosh, HR is here, shh, stop talking. No, they're not that special. It's another job.
yep, exactly. And we can go down the whole uh, rabbit hole of HR, and I don't want to go there because I want to make sure that we learn from you and your skill set and expertise. And one thing in particular that I think you're quite eloquent and communicate quite effectively, and your LinkedIn profile tells a lot about who you are and what you're doing. And one quote in your LinkedIn profile that I want to dig into here is that you say you help people supercharge their believability, their networkability, their marketability, and their hireability so that they can have a career in life that they're actually proud of. So that is a well crafted sentence that you probably spent a lot of time into. And I'd like to dig a little bit into there about each of those, the believability, networkability, marketability, and hireability, and what you're hoping, what you do with your clients and with people that you talk to on each of those levers.
Yeah. Um, it's very overwhelming whether you are 30 years in companies or in your career, whether you're 3 years in a company. When suddenly you're out on your own and you need to get back in there, it's overwhelming. And one of the things I like to do is practically break things down and show that it's possible. And you don't have to be a certain type to be networking well. You don't have to be a certain type, and I'm putting this in air quotes, to appear more marketable than someone in a similar space. I would potentially call them your competition. So I like to break some of these myths. And in these four levers, if you kind of are firstly aware that they exist, and then you take one or two simple steps in each of them, you're already exponentially at a better stage than you were before you started this whole career change, job search, whatever situation you find yourself in. So believability is a very hard pill to swallow when I talk about it, because when I used to interview in certain places, Al, you've been to hundreds of interviews, right? Sometimes we go to interviews because we want experience, sure, but sometimes we go and we think, I would love this job, but we shoot ourselves in the foot because we don't really think we're going to get it. So if we don't think so, why would the person on the other side think so? So I always talk about, before you are believable to someone else, you got to be believable in, you got to believe it yourself. And not trying to sound woo here, but there's enough data to show that confident that, like, you don't have to be the most qualified person. In fact, the people who get the job are not always the most qualified. They're the ones who are more confident, appear more confident. Yes, it's unfair, but life is unfair. So the believability, that's step one. The network ability is because no man is an island. Yeah, no woman is sitting here alone in St. Lucia. You've got to have people around you. And it doesn't only mean work colleagues and corporate colleagues. It could be someone who's, in your yoga class in the gym, someone whose kid and your kid used to be at creche or daycare together, and you suddenly remembered them because you saw something on Facebook. And Jim Rohn said, um, the you are who you surround yourself with, right? And you are
Yeah.
the sum of five people that you most hang out with. The good news of what he said, because I think he said this 30, 40, 50 years ago, the good news is these are not people who are only in your physical space. These are also people who you've never met before, but you hang out because you see their stuff on YouTube or you listen to their podcast. So surround yourself with people who are positive and don't tear each other down and are not negative about things and negative about life. Believability, networkability, marketability, your documents. You got travel documents, you got a passport, you got a visa to go somewhere. Well, you need career documents. These are your marketing documents, right? Your resume, your LinkedIn. If you I don't hate cover letters, but some people need them, they're rigid about them. So do you have something nice, interesting on LinkedIn? Do you have some portfolio? Do you have anything that you can show versus tell, right? Show and tell. So the show part is also as important as the tell. So that's the marketability. And the hireability is, how do you go from actually having all these amazing fancy documents to actually getting a job offer, closing the deal? That's what they say in sales, and you're pretty much a salesperson. Everybody works in sales. So these four things, when you go through these, when I wrote this down, I was like, yes, you've got to view this as an entire sales process. You are the CEO of your career, you're the chief sales officer, you're the chief revenue officer, you are the chief
Yeah.
marketing officer, chief HR officer, everything. And you are this is the one person company. No one's coming to save you. You've got the job, but sometimes your ego is going to say you've got this even when you don't. And if it's been a while and you think you need to enlist help, do not think that coaches like Al are out there to get your money. There's some people who are doing amazing work, and if you work with a really good coach, and I know this sounds like I'm tooting my own horn because there is a conflict of interest, but anytime you work with someone who's really good, they're going to 5x 10x your investment, which from the last time I checked is better than any stock, shares, investments, blockchain, mutual funds, all of the stuff out there. So, quick summary of those four pillars in the career space.
And, and that's a great point, like working with a coach. And again, like I'm not trying to toot my horn or your horn, but, and you mentioned this earlier in our conversation too about executive recruiters, which are also known as headhunters. People don't always realize that those recruiters, those external headhunters, which a lot of job seekers try to like search for, like when they reach out to me, they're like, are you a recruiter? Can you put me in touch with a recruiter? Recruiters work for the company. When the external recruiter gets paid, they get paid 30 to 33% of your first year salary. And they don't care if they're getting Sonal the job or Alan the job or Ralph the job. They just want someone to get the job. Whereas someone like you, someone like me, our business is predicated on, are we getting people successful outcomes? Um, and you mentioned, so talk a little about that and the incentive structure of what the difference is between a headhunter versus what the incentive structure is versus like with me or you or some other great career coaches out there. Like,
So,
what's the
in
motivation for you to do the work that you're doing, me to do the work I'm doing, versus what a headhunter is essentially
Yeah, yeah.
motivated to do?
Firstly, I can't stand this term headhunter. It just sounds
Yeah,
so violent, right?
yeah,
So, in the recruiting space, right, to just sort of simplify it, you typically have three types. You've got the headhunter. These are typically executive recruiters, fancy word, headhunter.
yeah.
And they are looking at senior level executive talent across. They build a nice little database. When they find you, they pitch the job to you, but obviously they get the commission from the company. But I just wanted to add one thing to what you said, because you said they don't really care if it's Sonal, if it's Al, or if it's Tom, Dick, or Harry that they place. They do care to a little extent, because in some companies, at least in Europe, I know this is very common, they have a clause in their contract that the person has spent at least 12 months in the company, because should that person leave in 6 months or 9 months, the company
Yes.
that paid them a crap load of money, sometimes
There's a
I'm talking
clawback.
Russell Reynolds, Heidrick struggles, they can go up to 70-80K per position.
Yep.
Then when I used to be in those roles in HR, and if that person left, I would go to that recruiter saying, either I want my money back, or you find me a replacement, and I
Yep.
want a replacement in the next few weeks, because we are bleeding money. So yes, they do care because they want good people.
Yes.
So you have those three. You have the executive recruiters. Then you have the other type of recruiter who's also external, but they tend to be affiliated to a staffing firm where they do a lot of bulk hiring. So a classic example of this would be either they hire specifically for IT roles, project, etc. And the other one is more temp sort of staffing, which is more on the junior side. So those are the two. The big names there are Randstad, Adecco, Manpower, etc. Then the third is internal recruiters. Now, internal recruiters have a very different incentive system, because they get an annual salary and the company saves a lot of money by hiring them. Because what you would pay an external recruiter for one hire, you get an internal recruiter and their entire annual salary is equal to, let me say this slowly. Their entire annual salary of one internal recruiter is equal to one or two hires that they have
Yep.
made, because the company has made their money back. So, how you approach them matters, because the external headhunter will, if they don't have a position, they'll put you on file, but it's not in their interest to be in touch with you. It's in your
Right.
interest, right? Internal recruiters, same thing. But more often than not, internal recruiter is very happy that you were in their database and they didn't have to pay LinkedIn 100,000 a
Yep.
year to have seats, because LinkedIn sells, this is what they do, talent solutions, this is how LinkedIn makes money, or Indeed or ZipRecruiter, etc. If they have found you and you're amazing, the cost of hiring you was zero. So it is very much in your interest to be on their radar, see what positions are out there. Now, a career coach, there's a good career coach and there's a great career coach. um, a good career coach does everything they say they'll do. They help you get your marketing documents ready. They help you to get your interview, all of that stuff ready. A great career coach does exactly the same thing, holds your hand along the way, but also leverages their own network, which usually tends to be massive if you are not a career coach who's 22 years old. If you are somebody who has been around the block a few times, I do this, I leverage my network. And whether it works out, it's not the point. The point is, career coaches are people who had very interesting careers already in the past. So they are not a one trick pony. They can do lots of things. So a career coach is someone who will not only do coaching, they'll also do mentoring. They are not always your best friend. Best friends want to be, coddled. They're not going to be that. They're not going to be doing that. They're going to be showing you tough love when you need it. And that is the difference between a good and a great, is they show you the mirror even when you don't like it. and not always cheerleading and telling you everything's going to be okay. Just change your mindset, because that irks me like anything. That's not why you pay good money to someone. These are people who get into the mentoring side of things. So it's the word coach is very debatable, because this person ends up being like a guide, and have usually also been there, done that. They've been through rejections as well, and they're passing on their learnings to you so that you can do it in 1/10 of the time and avoid those mistakes that a career coach knows intimately. So, a good career coach has made a lot of mistakes, and that is where their value comes in, so that you do not make those mistakes and you get to your destination faster. And yes, I believe in shortcuts. I never used to believe it. I used to think they're snake oil salesmen. But yes, there are shortcuts when the person who's telling you the directions knows what they're talking about.
Yep. Spot on. And you said that there are good career coaches. There's great career coaches. I would also say that there are a lot of crap career coaches, aka snake oil salesmen. We don't need to go there right now. Let's talk more about the positive side. And very similar, I call myself a career accelerator.
Mm.
You call yourself like supercharging careers. Very similar. You're like,
Yeah, I
we
mean,
work
that's
with
my
you.
company name. I called
Yeah,
it Supercharge when I got the
yeah,
domain. Yeah.
exactly. I like my original name was Kadima Careers uh, Career Accelerator, XLR8R. Um, but I love how you think about that, because like when someone works with you, they get like they supercharge, they get a turbo boost in their career, and you are also like in your LinkedIn headline, you're like insider secrets to supercharge your career. So without spilling all the beans, share some insider secrets here that you find to be most common that will supercharge and boost someone's career search.
Mm. Um, so many, my goodness. So, for example, the it is so much easier when you know what people want, and when you show up and you literally give it to them on a platter, they can't understand why you're not on their side, like what's going on. So it's like, you know, in India we say, we always have jokes about, you want something, then make the mother-in-law is always vilified, poor thing. I have a lovely mother-in-law. So it's like, make it look like to her that it was her idea, and she's like, yeah,
Yeah.
why didn't I think of that? And I'm like, actually it was my idea, but very sneaky, very smart. So when you know what a recruiter wants, when you know what a hiring manager wants, it is so much easier. So I'll give you, for example, as an internal recruiter, if you know what their key performance indicators are, KPIs, then you show empathy that only 1 out of 100 people show. So, they care about turnaround time. They care about looking good to their boss. And if you know you're the right person for the job, and you know you're not going to cost the company by coming in either through a referral, or if they say, yes, we have three availabilities, we have the coming Friday, the following month 21st, or June the 30th, take the first date,
Yes.
because when the time will come and they find the perfect Mr. Al, not going to wait for Simon. You're not going to wait for anyone else. It's gone. The position is gone. So,
So true.
in their interest to close the position quickly, because you know that the longer they take, the company's bleeding money. So, that's example number one. Another example could be, you know, insider secrets. One of the things I don't like is when people talk on LinkedIn on how things should be. I'm a pragmatist. Yes, I am
Yes.
also an idealist, but I'm also like, this is the way the world is. I wish it were different. Rather than go and have a drum and complain about it, I can actually attack the problem with the way it exists today, because I'm a big fan of stoicism. So people are like, in the salary negotiation process, when they want to know what your salary expectations are, just throw it back to them and tell
Yes.
them
That is some
instead.
sick advice.
Tell them instead, um, no, I'd rather know what your budget is. Listen, be careful who you take advice from. Some people, some recruiters are okay with this approach. Okay. And I know this particular piece of advice comes very heavily from like the Western Hemisphere. It will not fly in every part of the world. I When I was doing a lot of recruiting, I didn't like cocky candidates. I was a painful recruiter. I liked candidates who were humble and who were down to earth and who would answer the question. So if you answer a question with a question instead of a statement, it just be careful that you might be taking a risk. So instead of focusing on how things should be, focus on give them the answers, make it straight. Don't give these tried and tested answers that you think are going to work because some coach somewhere told you. Convert your weakness into a strength. All of that crap. Come from a place of how well you know yourself, how confident you are. At the same time, you're humble. Yes, it's a two-way street. Yes, they are buying something. Yes, you are selling something. I also want to be careful. I don't live in a scarcity mindset. But the way the things are, it's not exactly a 50-50 today. It might be 51 and 49 in terms of the power balance. It's okay. It's okay. There was a time when it used to be 99 and 1 in terms of power balance, which means it's in the favor of companies versus the candidate. It is much more equal today, but it's a market. You're selling something, they want to buy
Yep.
something. If they give you any weird any weird signs, do not brush it off. Do not ignore your instincts. So many, I mean, my goodness, I can think of at least a few more, but they'll come to mind. But you know Also people say ask your questions in the end. And why ask your questions anytime they come up in the interview process. Do not wait for the end, because sometimes it's natural. There was a certain conversation, there was a certain flow, and the bus has left the station. Now suddenly you're going back and asking at the very end. So I am a big fan of make it conversational. Do not think of interview as an interview. Think of it as a conversation. The best interviewers in the world that I have worked with did not treat it like a classic interview, because that's not the kind of culture they were promoting internally. I
Yeah.
hope this kind of helps a bit. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot more where that came from.
Yeah, no, that's great. And it's interesting on the power balance, whether it's 99 to 1 or 51 to 49. I generally, my perspective is as you're in the recruiting process, as you're in the job acquisition process, the power is heavily weighted in the company's favor often because they know the whole roster of other candidates that they are considering. They know the
Yeah.
interview questions that they are going to ask you.
And
They
I'm just going
know,
to add here, Al,
yeah,
also there is asymmetry of information. So when they ask
yes,
you what are your salary expectations, there is a complete
yes,
lack of transparency of information. You
said,
do not know. However, the closer you are to the offer stage, I didn't complete that earlier, the power dynamic has shifted. Because when you get
yes,
an offer, no company in the history of the world makes two offers like to two people. They will never do that, because the fact that they've given you an offer, they have put their cards out on the table, they are lying there naked, and you've got them by you know what. But that doesn't mean you abuse that power. And by the way, the
right,
same thing applies to companies. When companies abuse their power, candidates don't like it. So it's a question of you've got the cards close to your chest. You've been doing everything well, you've been playing your cards right, and the time has come to the offer. Now the power has shifted. So obviously take advantage of
yes,
this leverage. The best leverage you can have is if you have two offers, because you can choose and you've got to be selfish. Remember, we said you're the CEO of your career, because companies typically have three top candidates. Why can't you have two or three top companies? Like you said, job acquisition, I absolutely love that. So
yeah,
it's
and
just a question of that power dynamic shifting, and really different compared to what it was in our parents' time.
yes, and you're just so quick and sharp that you jump to my conclusion. But what I was trying to say is that the power dimension changes throughout the interview process. So early on, you have no insight, no leverage, and that leverage comes a little bit further into your favor as you proceed. And once you get that offer, which is exactly what you said there, once you get that offer, that is the first time when you have you have leverage, because that company is saying, Sonal, we chose you. We want to hire you. It doesn't mean that they don't have a plan B or a plan C, but they chose you. And then you have leverage. And that's where I generally tell people, that's where you can ask the harder questions. You can ask some questions up front, but if you're concerned about work-life balance, if you're concerned about the hours, if you're concerned about vacation time, if you're concerned about,
Exactly. And if you're concerned with learning, oh, I see that the headquarters of this company is in Paris, and I think I would be required to, attend executive meetings with my French colleagues. I would love to learn the French language. Would you be able to sponsor my
yes,
language courses from level A1 to level A3? Not a time to ask at the start of the interview. People get turned off.
exactly.
Timing is everything, and you're reasonable. You're not asking for a round the world trip which starts in Monaco, Monte Carlo, and you're buying a Ferrari. You're being reasonable. And companies like smart, intelligent questions, which, frankly speaking, anyone can ask. It's not rocket science. Just open one page of Dale Carnegie. You'll already
I
be
have I have him on
100
my back.
times more educated than before. It's like from the 19, I think 1936 is when he wrote it. It's still a classic almost 90 years later.
Yeah, I think I just Googled it today. I think it's 1939, but yeah, it
1939.
is like How to Win Friends and Influence People. Fantastic book. Now I'm reading actually Stop Worrying and Start Living by him as well, which is another old book, but it's still timeless. So those are two great books for people to read. Um, so you talk a little bit about like people turbo boosting their career and that they should be the CEO of their career. You see a lot of these layoffs occurring now where it's evident that people can be at the whims of an organization. I'm a big proponent that people should be owning their career, be the CEO of the career. Talk to me about like how when you coach your clients, when you talk to people, how you suggest that like, and you also talked a little bit more about what should be versus what is. So
Hmm.
what should be is a company should give a shit about people. What is a company cares about profit and bottom line.
Don't hold your breath if they don't care.
Right. So talk about like that whole
Hmm.
philosophy of being the CEO of your career, and that's what you really instill in your clients and your podcast and your YouTube channel. But talk a little bit what that means to you and how you think people, because like you and I keep saying this over and over again because people are not hearing it. But talk to me like what it means to be like the CEO of your career or owning your career, and why that's so important for you and the advice that you give your clients.
The reason I talk so much about this, and I will continue to talk about it till pretty much till I die, is because I never did this. So we talked about mistakes earlier. I never took ownership of my career because I always thought someone is taking care of me. So you've seen that cartoon, like there's a kid with the balloon, be like Tom, don't be like me, okay? Don't do what I did. Because it hurt me. It hurt me for years. And instead, what you want to do is, so some very simple tactical advice I'll give. Do not do what I did. What does that mean? When I was actively in the job market, for example, 20 that period in around 2011, then I got laid off, then I was again in the job market in 2015, then I got laid off. Another story for another day. But what I used to do during those times is I would subscribe to the job alerts on Indeed and LinkedIn and all these websites. The moment I signed my contract and the moment I started working, what do you think the first thing I did was? I unsubscribed from these alerts because I'm like, I don't need
Yeah.
it. They are so spammy.
Yeah.
Instead, I wish that I would have done something simple, that instead of sending me daily, send me weekly or send me monthly or whatever. It doesn't matter. Who cares if it's spamming your inbox, Sonal? What is wrong with you? Because you, ABL, always be looking. Always be
Yes.
looking. You are not cheating your husband or your wife or your partner by doing that. You're not flirting. There's nothing wrong. The difference, thank God, between a company and a spouse is, hopefully with a spouse it's
Yes.
forever. And even if it's not
Yeah.
forever, you'll find, you're happy by yourself or you're with someone. The difference is with a company, it's okay to keep changing in your best interest. I
Yeah.
had someone on my podcast who was she's amazing. Shout out to Suzanne Lucas. She calls herself the evil HR lady, and she talked about how she got an amazing job in the US, and then 2 weeks later she got an even better job. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is gonna sound like, oh, I'm. And she went to her boss, but she left, and you know what? They got it. Her boss said, if I were in your situation, I would have done the same thing because it was a manager role. It was very, very senior. She would do things she would never have done in her current role. So she took ownership, and it was so boring compared to this or compared to that. So that is number one. Number two is, Jedi. I'm a Star Wars fan. Jedi mind tricks. You're not manipulating people, but don't expect strangers to bring up your name in high stakes important meetings in your absence. People
Yeah.
who are going to bring up your name in your absence are people who care about you. So you want to be top of mind that, you know, you're hanging out. Let's say you're having lunch with you're having lunch. This is another example. It's time for lunch. You go to the office cafeteria. You're by yourself. My God, this used to irk me so much. I would have colleagues who would always go together, come back together. They would have a little box with their little cute little tiffin with hummus and cucumber, and they would be like pretty much 5 days a week do that. There were times I was with them. I would have amazing, like, it was so much fun. You have such gossip. These are great sources of gossip. And then you're back to work. But there were times when their schedule, my schedule clashed. So I'd be at the cafeteria and I'd be alone. I loved it. I'm an extrovert. I should hate it. But I loved it because I would sit with a total stranger or in a group. Like, would you mind if I sit next to you? Contrary to popular belief, this is not high school anymore. No one is going to look at you and say, you cannot sit with us. Like Mean Girls. No one does that. Thank God we've all grown up, right? So you learn and you're like, oh my gosh, I sat next to the CFO. I had no idea. And then they find out about you. So get out of your circle, get uncomfortable. Actually, it's not as uncomfortable as it looks once you're inside. It's like, you're at the deep, you're at the shallow end, you're dipping your toes. My God, it's so cold. I can't go in. You go in, actually, the water's fine and it's not as scary as you thought it was. So, people who will talk about you when you're not in the room are people who genuinely like you. So, be likable. Yes, be competent. Obviously, you need to know what you're doing, but I will take that as a baseline. Let's take it as a baseline, even though it's not true that most people know what they're doing. Most people are competent at their job, but they are not always the ones that get ahead. The ones that get ahead do a little bit more schmoozing without without making it icky, because it's just in their nature. They're just likable. They ask a lot of questions. Be so curious, like Socrates, right? Why? But why? But why? Just ask questions. Make people talk as much as possible so they like being around you. Back to Dale Carnegie, remember? He said, ask a question that the other person would enjoy answering.
Yes.
When was the last time you've done that, right? When you do that on a regular basis, like, I see that you're a research scientist. I'm currently in food protein and food coloring, because I used to be in the research space when I was in HR. I'm in this space, but how did you get into this research scientist place? Okay, what are a couple of books that helped you? You're genuinely asking questions, but it is so flattering and honoring for the other person. Like, she wants to know about me, little old me. And whether you're doing this with the janitor or whether you're doing this with the CEO, it doesn't matter. You do not differentiate. You just become this person. When you enter the room, you just lift the energy. And I had another podcast guest who said, between two things, you got a radiator, you switch on the radiator, there is warmth in the room, and then you have a drain. The drain sucks everything out of the room. If you have two choices, you could be a radiator, be a drain. Always be a radiator. They just warm people, and when you're around them, you're like, oh my God, this is such a mess, but Al is here. It's going to be okay. Even if Al doesn't know what he's doing, it's going to be okay, because there's something about Al. There's something about Mary. So the ones that get ahead are not always the smartest. Newsflash. The ones that get ahead are the ones who are likable, who care. Yes, they do a bit of schmoozing. There's nothing dirty about it. There's nothing wrong with it. It's really a win-win. It helps the company, it helps them, and it helps their colleagues around them.
And it helps that individual too. I've learned so
Oh,
much about meeting all these people, like meeting you. Just
yeah.
like uh, I am better because of
Yeah,
people that
me
I've met.
too. And it's the reason I started my podcast. It was totally selfish reasons. Others come for the ride. It's a great cherry on the cake, but it's always from a
Yeah,
place of, I want to learn something today.
yeah.
And if you have the same beliefs you had in 2017, because I have changed over time, 2017, 2018, if you still holding on to those beliefs like so tightly, right? It's time maybe to question yourself and maybe open a book like Think Again by Adam Grant.
Yes,
Because
another
it's,
person I'm a big fan of. Like
yeah.
you and I are, like yeah. Even though we've grown up halfway across the world from one another, there's so much similarities here. So we are approaching the end of the podcast. I generally ask people for one last piece of sick advice, but because you have dropped so many, if you're okay with a great piece of sick advice, I'm going to go with be a radiator and not a drain. I love that. So
That credit to that goes to Richard Robinson. He was on my podcast.
credit where credit is due. So two last questions I have for you. Where can people find you?
Easy. I'm super active on LinkedIn, but you'll find all my links, podcast, YouTube. You'll find all my links on my website, superchargeyourself.com.
Awesome. And then the last question, I told you this one was coming. What should we title this podcast?
Career talk with an Indian and a Jew. How does that sound?
That sounds good. uh, awesome, Sonal. Well, I've enjoyed getting to know you over the last 15 months over the internet, and then being on a guest on your podcast, having you on my podcast. If you're in Brussels, right?
Correct.
Yeah. Next time I'm in Brussels, which is one of the, I have not been there. It's I've
If
been to
I
41
find out
countries.
that you came, and if I find out you were here and you didn't look me up, like, honestly, I mean, you're dead to me.
And same to you. Next time in New York, definitely let me know. But
For sure.
it's been such a pleasure. I've learned a lot from you on LinkedIn and even in this conversation. I appreciate your background, your experience, your generosity with your spirit and your information. And thank you for being part of the SYCK Career Podcast.
Super delighted. Thank you so much for having me.